Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. If you're one of my students, you may laugh at my t-shirt, okay? You have my permission to do that. My mother just got me this and I'm really happy with it. One of the main reasons why I am here today talking to you is that I feel that Ecuador is one of those countries that do not get a lot of attention when it comes to literature, especially in the context of Latin America. I have talked a lot about the literature of Argentina, of Mexico, of all the southern cone countries because that's kind of my area of expertise. But as you know, I like to promote Latin American literature, especially among the English-speaking public. So one thing that I thought was, hey, let's talk about Ecuador. Now, here's something. This is not the first time that I talk about Ecuadorian literature. A very long time ago, I don't even know how long, I did a video on 4 Latin American avant-garde novellas, and in that video I shared with you some ideas on Pablo Palacios' Débora. So that was the first time that I talked about Ecuadorian literature. This time we are going to explore a text that is a little bit more traditional, and it's a novel. It's titled Huasipungo by the author Jorge Icaza, so a namesake of mine. In English, because this has been translated into English, this is known as The Villagers. I am going to refer to it as Huasipungo because I read it in Spanish. I bought this little book back in 2012, if you can believe that, and I have finally read it. So let me tell you about it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a little bit of context here, especially when it comes to the history, very briefly, and also the literature. So if you look at the first decades, the first 3 decades of the 20th century in Ecuador, we are looking at a very turbulent time, politically speaking. This is not surprising because we are dealing, after all, with Latin America. And the literature, of course, reflects that. If you go to the literature of Ecuador and you look at the late 1920s and the early 1930s, you're going to find that there are 2 currents that are primarily evident there. One of them is the avant-garde, and the other one is a kind of social realism. So in other words, you're looking at a text like Débora by Pablo Palacio as an example of the avant-garde, and on the other hand, of course, at something like Huasipungo as an example of this social realism. There's another thing that is really important about Huasipungo, and that is the fact that this is a novel that is kind of a landmark in indigenista literature. Indigenismo is a literary current that explores the lives of the native inhabitants of the American continent, their traditions, their language, their plight, etc. So it's a very important literary movement in Latin America. Now this one, Huasipungo, may also be read, just so you know, as a proletarian novel. So before, when I spoke of social realism, I hesitate to speak of socialist realism, but I think in this case you can really make a case for that. It is really appropriate because we are dealing with a novel that explores the dynamics of power, of class struggles, of that dichotomy between the oppressor and the oppressed. One thing that we really have to look at in the case of Huasipungo, first of all, before we talk about anything else, is the title. Because what we have here is a Quechua word. And it's really, you know, not self-evident, not even for me, right? And I come from Latin America, so we should establish the meaning of this word before we go into the text. So if you look at the etymology here, we have a word that is composed of 2 words, actually, Huasipungo. Huasi means house, and then punku means door. So when you take that literally, what Huasipungo means is a house at the entrance. So what was Huasipungo? Or what is a Huasipungo? A Huasipungo is basically a parcel of land that the landowner gives to the workers so that they can live there, keep their animals there, and work the land also for their own benefit and survival. And they are given that in exchange for their work. So it's a system that is kind of, sounds a little bit medieval, you know, it's almost like a sharecropping type of system. So that is what the title refers to. It refers to this piece of land right there, and that is something that unfortunately is lost when you translate the title into English, as it was translated as The Villagers, which I think is a good translation of the title, not a literal one, but you know, something to stand for the novel, but once again you lose that idea of what it means. So I thought we might look at the plot and the characters a little bit. Before that, let me tell you that Huasipungo is 190 pages in length. It is quite fast-paced, and when we think about that, we have to consider that Jorge Icaza, the author, began his career as a dramatist. So that has a lot to do with the structure of the novel, the way that he presents the characters, the way that the action develops, and so many other things. The first character that we meet in Huasipungo is a guy by the name of Don Alfonso Pereira. And he's from the capital, he lives in Quito, and he's worried about his honor. This is on page 1, okay? Because this is what has happened. His daughter was left pregnant by a cholo. A cholo is a mestizo. And what is a mestizo? A mestizo is somebody who has mixed European and native heritage. So this guy left his daughter pregnant and then he just disappeared. And that, as you know, in Latin American culture is kind of like a, a stain, a very big stain on your honor. Now, a way out of the problem presents itself really, really quickly at the beginning of the novel, because by chance, Don Alfonso meets his uncle Julio. And his uncle Julio, to whom Alfonso owes a lot of money, tells him, hey, I have this business proposition for you. There's this wonderful chance, wonderful business deal opportunity that we have right here with some gringos who are ready to come here to Ecuador and exploit the woods. And there's also talk of oil probably being present or being a possibility there at some point. So this is just the perfect excuse for Don Alfonso, because he gets the opportunity to leave the capital with his wife and his daughter so that the child can be born someplace else. Then when they return to the capital, the kid has already been born, and he can even pass this kid as his own child, So perfect opportunity for him. He leaves the capital and goes to this place outside with his family. The conflict, okay, how is this conflict introduced? Here's what happens. So in order to exploit the woods, they have to do two things first. One of them is that a road must be built, okay? And the other one is that the Huasipungos have to be just cleared, because they're kind of in the way of progress, well, both from their perspective, figuratively and literally. So that is something that is there in their plans. Now, the Indios, the natives, they could be used as labor in order to build this road, but they are definitely not going to be happy about the fact that they are going to lose their homes, because these lands, the Huasipungos, are basically all that they have. They consider those lands to belong to them because they depend on those lands for survival. So there you have the basic plot and the basic conflict of this novel. And the dynamics here are really quite simple when you think about it. It's basically what you have: the white man exploiting the cholo or mestizo, the person of mixed heritage, and then the cholo exploiting the indio, who is the native inhabitant of the land. So it's really a system that is just rotten to the core, and it's just doomed to produce very, very violent and very important and unavoidable conflict, I would even say. So I gave you some of the characters, but there are some missing. Okay, so let's look at some other characters. Let's go a little bit more in depth so that we can meet other people here who push the action forward. So the baby is born at one point in the novel, and they need milk to be provided for this kid. So they bring an India, or a native woman. Her name is Kunshi. And Don Alfonso immediately begins to lust after her. This was something that was also, unfortunately, quite common in those days. So Kunshi is married to Andres Chiliquinga. He is an Indio, of course, just like her. And he is the one, Andres is one of the most important characters that we meet in the novel, because he's one of those characters who develop in this story as we continue to read. Andres is a very violent man. He seems to be instinctive or quite impulsive, at least. And this impulsive nature of his leads to an accident at the beginning, or in the first third of the novel, that is going to change his life forever. I'm not going to give you more details because I would like for you to read this novel and I don't want to ruin it for you. So we have Kunshi, her husband Andres, and there's also a character, he's a cholo or a mestizo, mixed heritage, by the name of Gabriel Rodriguez. He is the manager. So he stands in the middle. Remember, in this dynamics of oppressed and oppressor, he is both oppressed and the oppressor in one way, because he's right there in the middle. And there's an interesting detail about Gabriel de Cholo. He has just one eye. Okay, so notice the symbolism right there. Maybe not very subtle, okay, but one eye, perspective limited, you know, just one viewpoint, etc., etc. So I thought that was an interesting touch right there. And then last but not least, we have one important character that I have not mentioned, and that is the priest. Listen to this. The first thing that we see of the priest is his lover. Okay, so from the very start, from the very beginning, the first thing that we know about him, we know that he is corrupt, that he is just a hypocrite, and he's not really practicing what he preaches. Now, as a matter of fact, if you really look at him, he's kind of more like an instrument of power. Okay, power it uses him in a way to, further their own interests. He is used in order to control the Indios through their fear, through their perceived superstition. But of course, the priest also acts out of his own interest. So this is something where he benefits one way or the other. One thing that he does is that he charges the Indios for masses, for example, at high prices. And he also makes them believe that people buried in certain parts of a cemetery are closer to heaven, or that they're going to find it easier to get there. So he is really using sacred things in order to get his own advantage and to take advantage of the people. There is one particular scene that kind of stood out to me that is really disgusting, in which Don Alfonso and the priest take turns with a chola or a mestiza, so a woman of mixed heritage. And once again, this is another thing that was unfortunately quite normal, between, you know, quotation marks. In this case, I'm using the word normal as just what it means literally, you know, the norm, not a good thing or bad thing, not a value judgment, but basically what went on most of the time in those days. Let's talk a little bit about the style now. So we have looked at the characters, a little bit at the plot. And the style really struck me as being quite elaborate and also, you know, somewhat archaic, especially when it comes to the descriptions. I thought, for example, of Benito Pérez Galdós, the great Spanish novelist. But there's a very important difference that we have to point out here, and that is the added note of sarcasm, which is quite heavy and quite enjoyable, I would say, too, in its own way. There's quite a bit of interior monologue also in this novel, which also makes it very interesting. If you look at the descriptions, they are both graphic and poetic. So one connection that I made right there when I thought of that was with Los de Abajo, the Underdogs by Mariano Azuela. And of course, you're very welcome to check out my video on that novella about the Mexican Revolution, if you are so inclined. So there's plenty of dialogue here in Huasipungo, and you're going to find profanity, very interestingly, both in the dialogue and in the interior monologue passages. So that really adds to the realism. If you look at the first page of the English translation, you're going to see what I mean. So I was really, really surprised to find that kind of language, just very honest and very direct and very realistic in this novel. And then let's not forget, very important element here of the style and the dialogue are the native words. So as a matter of fact, in my Cátedra edition, you have like a little, little vocabulary section at the end, and also footnotes to the effect of that, the whole idea of translating the native words. And I was really surprised, let me tell you this, to recognize many words that we actually used in Argentina too. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So they spoke of locro, right? Locro is a type of food. It's kind of like a soup. And we had that in Argentina, and it's actually quite common for people to eat that. And they also spoke of the pupo. Okay, so the pupo is like just a very familiar name for the belly button. We use that in Argentina all the time. And also something that really was very nice for me, at least, that in the transliteration of the dialogue by the natives, you can also tell that they use the sh sound. Okay, and we use that in Argentina. Of course, it's part of our accent, as when I say "Yo me llamo Jorge" and nobody asks me where I'm from, because they can tell. It's like he's from Argentina or from Uruguay, so if they had to guess, they would probably say Argentina, and they would be correct. But I was really, really amused, and it was nice, to find that familiarity right there with some words and also with the pronunciation itself. So there are two things here that I wanted to mention that are just pieces of criticism that some critics have raised against this novel. And the first one is the idea that the characters are flat. Okay, so we have the evil landowner, the evil priest, the evil cholo, the evil gringos, the violent Indio, the suffering India. You know what I'm saying? It seems like they are more types than characters. So that is one thing that critics said about this novel. And the second one that kind of stood out from the criticism that I read was dealing with the, I would say, the rushed development of the action. And please note, we are talking about 190 pages, and I didn't mention this. 190 pages is actually the extended or expanded edition of the novel. The original one was much shorter. So maybe we're looking at 150, 140 pages, almost like a novella. So those are two things that critics said. Now, regarding the first issue, what we have to point out here is that Icaza's main goal really with this novel was to denounce and to combat oppression. Okay, so you could say that the characters, the story, maybe even the text itself is an instrument to fight oppression. That is his main goal. And of course, we may agree or disagree with that. We may go for a more, art for art's sake kind of thing, or a more committed type of art, but that was his idea with this novel. And also, another thing that we have to consider is that unlike other authors, indigenistas or not, Icaza doesn't really take the Indio and turns him into a myth. He doesn't become some ethereal figure or anything like that. So you could say, yes, this may be imperfect, but it's definitely real, I believe. The realism is there. And regarding the second issue, the idea of the rushed development of the action and all that, the guy who put together this edition, guy by the name of Teodosio Fernandez, so he did the introduction, the notes, all of that stuff, he says, let's remember that Icaza began his career as a dramatist. Okay, so that may have something to do with the rushed nature of the action. And as a matter of fact, Huasipungo has been adapted to the stage. And you can tell, that it wouldn't be very difficult to adapt because of the dialogue, because of this whole idea of the rushed or the quick development of the action, which really serves to, prove a point and to get a point across to the reader. So I would say, dealing, here sharing my impressions with you, that I think Huasipungo is definitely not perfect. Okay, no novel is really, but this is a novel that has something to say, and the message is still relevant. So I think in that sense you could say that this is really a very effective text. And I believe that instead of focusing on the characters as we read it, we should pay more attention to the circumstances in order to get the most out of this novel. The circumstances and just the disgusting system that is being depicted and also denounced. So what you have here is, like, once again, a chain of exploitation, really, in which the white man exploits the cholo oppresses the Indio, and the gringos, a very important element in this whole formula or dynamics of power, is just the catalyst that sets everything in motion. And that is what you see in this novel in a very effective way, very well depicted. There was one scene that I wanted to kind of highlight, just to share with you some element from the text itself, and that is the scene of the death of the ox. So there's this ox that dies, right? And the Indios are like, hey, can you give us the meat? This is useless, you're not going to use it, can we just have the meat? That would be really, really nice. But Don Alfonso says, forget about it. We can't do that, because if we give them the meat now, then they're going to expect it also in the future. They may even kill the cattle themselves so that they can have more meat. So forget about it. We're just going to bury this dead ox. So it's completely useless, right? And here's the worst part of it. They use the Indios in order to dig the pit, right, where the ox is going to be buried. So some of the Indios take the opportunity and just, cut a little bit of meat to take with them. And the manager realizes that. So he searches all of them and just forces them to put that meat back into the pit and to bury it with the ox. So I think that scene right there speaks volumes, and it's really well narrated with a realism that is really, quite memorable. So I thought that was one thing that I wanted to share with you that really stood out for me as I read this novel, in terms of the plot and in terms of the images that are going to stay with me for a very long time. So the bottom line is that I thoroughly enjoyed Huasipungo. You know, I was really surprised, and I had been wanting for a very long time to read a realist, more quote-unquote traditional novel from Ecuador, because the other example, you know, Devora, is kind of avant-garde, and you know how the avant-garde is. It doesn't really give you a feel for what most authors were doing, which is part of the reason why some of us enjoy reading that type of text too. But Huasipungo really did not disappoint me at all. And it also inspired me to read a little bit more of this indigenista vein, because I'm going to be honest with you, this is not really my forte. It's not my area of expertise. So I definitely need to read more from those texts. And one thing that I'm happy about is that it is included, you know, Huasipungo, in this cátedra collection of the letras hispánicas, you know, the Hispanic literature, because I don't know, there's just like almost a physical pleasure when it comes to like opening and reading a cátedra text. That is the way that I feel about it. You're gonna think that I work for them or something, but I don't, honestly. Okay, I just very honestly enjoy and love reading these books. So, do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Huasipungo by Jorge Icaza. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.